In the quiet, unforgiving year of 1872, nestled deep within the craggy coastlines and dense, whispering pines of Maine, lay the isolated township of Blackwood Creek, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides and the changing seasons, where secrets were kept tight and strangers were eyed with suspicion. Yet even in this insular community, there existed a mystery that defied all understanding, a puzzle wrapped in human flesh, known simply as Elias Caldwell. He was the boy no one could explain, the child who effortlessly unraveled the very fabric of logic and reason, leaving behind a trail of unease and unanswered questions. His presence was a disquieting hum beneath the surface of everyday life, a discordant note in the otherwise predictable melody of Blackwood Creek. The first hint of Elias's unsettling nature emerged not with a bang, but with a barely perceptible tremor, a subtle shift in the ordinary that, in hindsight, marked the beginning of everything. He was but a babe, barely 6 months old, gurgling softly in his wooden crib while his mother, Sarah Caldwell, mended a torn shirt by the hearth. The room was warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and lavender. Suddenly, a small, polished wooden bird, a gift from Elias's grandfather, resting on the mantelpiece across the room, began to sway. It wasn't a draft, for the windows were latched tight against the late autumn chill. It swayed with an unnatural, deliberate motion. Then, with a soft clatter, it tumbled to the floor. Sarah, startled, glanced up, her needlework forgotten. Her eyes darted from the fallen bird to her infant son, who lay perfectly still, his wide, unnervingly lucid blue eyes fixed intently on the spot where the bird had been. There was no cry, no sudden movement from the child, only that unwavering gaze. Sarah dismissed it as a coincidence, a trick of the old house settling, perhaps. But a faint, cold prickle of unease, like an unseen spider crawling on her skin, had already begun to take root. Mr. Thomas Caldwell, a man of sturdy build and practical mind, found himself increasingly perplexed by these small, inexplicable occurrences. He was a fisherman, his life governed by the tangible realities of wind, weather, and the bounty of the sea. Yet in his own home with his own son, the world seemed to warp. He'd find tools misplaced in impossible locations, hear faint, rhythmic tapping sounds from Elias's room that ceased abruptly upon his approach, or witness objects gently slide across surfaces when no one was near them. He'd rationalize each incident, blaming faulty carpentry, drafts, or his own forgetfulness. But the rationalizations felt hollow, like poorly constructed dams against a rising tide of the unknown. Sarah, usually the more spirited of the two, grew quieter, her smile less frequent. The knot of unease within her had tightened, pulling at her composure, leaving her with a constant low thrum of worry. They spoke of it in hushed tones late at night, under the heavy quilts trying to find common ground for their shared bewilderment, only to find themselves circling the same unsettling void. The Caldwells were not alone in noticing the peculiar atmosphere that seemed to cling to their homestead. Blackwood Creek was a small town, and the lives of its inhabitants were intricately woven together. Neighbors, with their keen observations and even keener gossip, began to whisper. Old Mrs. Gable, whose prize-winning petunias suddenly withered and died the day Elias's pram was left unattended near them, spoke of a chill that went to the bone whenever she neared the Caldwell property. Young Timmy Miller, who once dared to retrieve a runaway ball from their yard, returned pale and trembling, muttering about shadows that moved on their own. No one spoke directly to Thomas or Sarah about these things, not openly, but their averted gazes, the subtle widening of eyes when Elias was mentioned, the way conversations died down when a Caldwell approached, all spoke volumes. A collective, unspoken understanding began to form. There was something different about Elias, something profoundly unsettling. The Caldwell house, once a beacon of neighborly warmth, slowly began to acquire an aura of quiet dread, a place to be avoided. And so, the central question began to coalesce, a silent query hanging in the salty sea air of Blackwood Creek, echoing in the minds of its inhabitants, and most profoundly, in the hearts of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell. What was Elias. Was he simply a child, albeit an unusual one, destined to grow out of these strange phenomena? Or was he something else entirely, something born of a different order, a being that defied the very laws of nature and science as they understood them? Why did he seem to challenge everything they knew, everything they believed to be true about the world? Why did his existence feel like a constant, quiet rebellion against the predictable, the logical, the explainable? The answers, if they even existed, remained shrouded in mystery, deepening the unsettling enigma of Elias Caldwell, the boy science couldn't explain. Elias Caldwell's birth had been unremarkable, a normal delivery in the Caldwell home, attended by the local midwife, Mrs. Peterson. He was a healthy baby, with a full head of dark hair and those striking blue eyes. Yet, even in those first moments, Mrs. Peterson had commented on his unusual stillness, a quietude that seemed almost unnatural for an infant. He rarely cried, his gaze strangely intense even in his earliest days, as if he perceived the world with a depth far beyond his tender age. Sarah and Thomas, exhausted but overjoyed, dismissed it as a blessing, a calm baby being a rare gift. But looking back, Sarah would often recall a faint, almost imperceptible chill that had permeated the birthing room the moment Elias drew his first breath, a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the window. As Elias grew from infancy into early childhood, the subtle oddities around him began to escalate, transforming from isolated incidents into a disquieting pattern. Objects would float, not dramatically but with an eerie slowness, a wooden block hovering for a moment before dropping softly to the floor, or a spoon sliding off the table as if nudged by an unseen hand. These occurrences always seemed to happen when Elias was nearby, his small, silent presence often the only constant factor. He rarely spoke, preferring to observe, his unblinking eyes tracking movements that no one else seemed to perceive. The family dog, a usually boisterous hound named Buster, would whimper and retreat to the farthest corner of the room whenever Elias entered, his tail tucked low and almost human fear in his eyes. Birds, typically a cheerful presence around the Caldwell cottage, would fall silent, their songs abruptly ceasing the moment Elias stepped into the garden, only to resume their chirping once he had gone back inside. The natural world itself seemed to react to Elias in peculiar ways. Sarah's carefully tended rose bushes, usually vibrant and full, would sometimes wither and turn brittle in patches where Elias had spent time playing, their petals shriveling as if struck by an unseen frost. Conversely, a stubborn patch of weeds by the back fence, which Thomas had battled for years, once exploded into an unnatural, vibrant bloom after Elias had sat near them for an afternoon, their blossoms a startling, almost luminous purple that defied the local flora. Unexplained cold spots became a common occurrence within the Caldwell home. A pocket of frigid air might suddenly materialize in the warmest room, causing goosebumps to rise on the skin, only to dissipate as quickly as it appeared, always seeming to follow Elias's quiet movements from room to room. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, initially trying to find mundane explanations for these phenomena, found themselves increasingly desperate. Thomas would meticulously check for drafts, examine the structural integrity of their furniture, and even consult old almanacs for unusual weather patterns. Sarah would rationalize the wilting plants as poor soil or disease, the flourishing weeds as an unexpected nutrient in the ground. But these explanations rang hollow, even to their own ears. The sheer frequency and the bizarre nature of the events began to chip away at their sturdy, practical sensibilities. They felt a growing sense of isolation, not just from their community, but from the very world they knew. Their home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage for an unfolding, inexplicable drama. Driven by a burgeoning fear and a desperate hope for answers, they began to seek help. Their first recourse was the local physician, Dr. Albright, a kind but traditional man who had delivered Elias. Dr. Albright examined the boy thoroughly, listening to his heart, checking his reflexes, and peering into his eyes. He found nothing amiss. Elias was, by all medical standards, a perfectly healthy child. When Sarah timidly described the floating objects and the strange cold spots, Dr. Albright offered a sympathetic but dismissive smile, suggesting perhaps a touch of nerves for Mrs. Caldwell and a child's vivid imagination for anything else. He prescribed a tonic for Sarah and advised plenty of fresh air. Unsatisfied, Thomas and Sarah ventured further afield, traveling to larger towns, seeking the opinions of more distant doctors, men with more advanced medical knowledge. They described the escalating oddities with increasing trepidation, their voices hushed, almost ashamed. Each doctor conducted their own examinations, ran their own tests, as rudimentary as they were in 1872. And each time the results were the same. Elias was physically sound. No discernible illness, no neurological disorder, nothing that could account for the strange occurrences. Some doctors suggested the parents were overly anxious, prone to seeing things that weren't there. Others, more charitably, labeled Elias as unusual, a medical anomaly, a child whose unique constitution simply defied current understanding. They offered vague diagnoses like nervous temperament or overactive imagination, but never anything concrete, never anything that truly explained the phenomena surrounding Elias. The unexplained label became a heavy burden, a weight that pressed down on the Caldwells, deepening their despair. It offered no comfort, no path forward, only a confirmation of their terrifying reality. Their son was an enigma, a living question mark that science in its current form could not resolve. The medical community had, in effect, washed its hands of Elias, leaving his parents adrift in a sea of bewilderment and fear. The more they sought answers, the more they were met with blank stares, polite dismissals, or thinly veiled accusations of delusion. The Caldwells were left alone with their unexplainable child, the strange occurrences continuing unabated, a constant, chilling reminder that their son was unlike any other, a boy who seemed to exist just beyond the veil of understanding. Their world, once so predictable, had been irrevocably altered, shadowed by the inexplicable presence of Elias. Elias grew older, but his quietude remained, deepening into an almost unnerving silence. He was a child of few words, his observations keen, his gaze seemingly piercing through the superficial layers of the world around him. While other children of Blackwood Creek chased each other through fields, shouting and laughing, Elias would sit alone, often in the deep shade of the ancient oak in their yard, his eyes fixed on distant points, on the intricate dance of insects, or the shifting patterns of light and shadow. He didn't play in the conventional sense, no make-believe games or boisterous romps. Instead, his interactions with the world were entirely singular, often marked by the strange events that continued to orbit him like satellites around an unseen sun. His parents watched him with a mixture of profound love and growing apprehension, unable to bridge the gap between their understanding and his inexplicable nature. The strange events, far from diminishing with his age, grew more pronounced, more frequent, and at times, far more unsettling. The flickering of lights, once a rare occurrence, became a common household phenomenon. Kerosene lamps would dim and brighten without anyone touching them, their flames dancing wildly as if caught in an unseen current, particularly when Elias was agitated, though his outward demeanor remained placid. On one memorable, terrifying evening, a small, uncontained flame ignited spontaneously on the kitchen table, engulfing a stack of newspapers in a sudden, intense burst of heat. Thomas, reacting quickly, doused it with water, but both he and Sarah had seen Elias standing silently in the doorway, his eyes wide, fixed on the burgeoning blaze, before it suddenly, inexplicably, extinguished itself as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind only charred paper and the acrid smell of smoke. Conversely, on other occasions, their hearth fire, roaring moments before, would simply wink out, leaving the room in sudden, oppressive darkness and a chill that seemed to seep into their very bones. The presence of Elias had a tangible effect on people, a palpable sense of dread that would settle upon those who came too close. Reverend Miller, a man of God known for his unwavering faith and robust constitution, once visited the Caldwell home to offer solace and prayer. He emerged an hour later, pale and trembling, his usual booming voice reduced to a whisper. He spoke of an unholy cold and a weight upon the spirit that had permeated the house, a feeling that intensified whenever Elias entered the room. He never returned. Other townsfolk reported a similar unease, a feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on their skin, or a sudden, inexplicable wave of sadness or fear that would wash over them when Elias was near. It was as if his very presence disrupted the natural order of emotions, casting a pall over the human spirit. Objects around Elias continued their bizarre dance of spontaneous manifestation and destruction. A cherished porcelain doll, belonging to a neighbor's child, left momentarily on the Caldwell's porch, was found later shattered into 1,000 pieces, though no one had touched it and there was no wind. Yet, conversely, a broken window pane, cracked during a particularly harsh winter storm, was discovered perfectly mended one morning, the glass seamless, as if it had never been damaged. These occurrences, seemingly random and without apparent cause, only added to the growing terror and bewilderment that surrounded the boy. The whispers in Blackwood Creek had long since turned into open fear. The Caldwell name, once respected, became synonymous with dread. People actively avoided their house, crossing the street if they saw a Caldwell approaching. Children were strictly forbidden from playing anywhere near Elias, their parents recounting tales of his strange abilities in hushed cautionary tones. The Caldwell family, once an integral part of the community, found themselves social outcasts, living in a self-imposed exile, shunned and feared by their neighbors. The silence that had once characterized Elias now extended to their entire existence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of isolation. Thomas Caldwell, a man who had always prided himself on his strength and ability to protect his family, found himself increasingly torn. He loved his son fiercely, a paternal bond that transcended the fear. Yet, even he could not deny the escalating strangeness, the palpable danger that seemed to emanate from Elias. He tried to shield Elias from the town's animosity, to explain away the incidents. But his own conviction wavered. A creeping fear, cold and insidious, began to take root in his heart. He saw the terror in his wife's eyes, the haunted look that had become a permanent fixture on her face. Sarah, once vibrant and resilient, retreated further into herself. She spent her days in a state of quiet despair, often ill with worry, her health deteriorating under the relentless strain of their extraordinary life. They tried to hide Elias from the world, to keep him within the confines of their isolated home, hoping that by containing his presence, they could contain the phenomena. But it was a futile effort. The world, it seemed, would not let them forget what resided within their walls. What was most perplexing, and perhaps most terrifying, was Elias's apparent lack of intentional control over these events. He rarely displayed strong emotions outwardly, his face a mask of quiet observation. Yet the phenomena seemed to mirror an internal state, a hidden turbulence beneath his calm exterior. When he was startled, lights might flicker violently. When he seemed upset, a chill would permeate the air, or objects would subtly shift. It was as if his very being was a conduit, an antenna for forces unknown, responding to his deepest, unexpressed feelings, amplifying them into tangible, physical manifestations. He was not maliciously causing these things. They simply happened around him, an extension of his inexplicable existence. He was a boy, yes, but he was also something else entirely, a living paradox, a creature of wonder and terror, trapped in a world that had no framework to understand him. His story was, by now, a whispered legend, a chilling tale of a child who defied all logic, a boy whose very presence twisted the fabric of reality, leaving Blackwood Creek in a perpetual state of unease and fear. The Caldwells, once a family like any other, had become guardians of an enigma, living under the shadow of a child whose potential for the unknown grew with each passing day. The whispered legends of Elias Caldwell, the boy science couldn't explain, eventually reached ears far beyond the isolated confines of Blackwood Creek. Rumors, embellished with each retelling, spoke of objects moving on their own, of strange atmospheric shifts, and of an unsettling aura that surrounded the Caldwell home. These tales, reaching the bustling intellectual circles of Boston, were largely dismissed as provincial superstition. However, one man, Professor Alistair Finch, a renowned scientist and investigator of anomalies from the esteemed Boston Scientific Society, found himself intrigued. Finch was a man of rigorous logic, a staunch advocate for empirical evidence, and a firm disbeliever in anything that couldn't be quantified or explained by the laws of physics. The very impossibility of the Blackwood Creek stories, their blatant defiance of scientific principles, was precisely what drew him. He saw not a supernatural phenomenon, but a scientific puzzle, an opportunity to either debunk local folklore or, more excitingly, to discover a previously unknown natural law. Armed with an array of the most advanced scientific instruments available in 1872, barometers, thermometers, electrometers, and early photographic equipment, Professor Finch journeyed to Blackwood Creek. His arrival caused a stir, a mixture of hope and suspicion among the townsfolk. They hoped he might offer an explanation, a solution to their unsettling problem, but they also feared his scientific skepticism would simply dismiss their lived experiences. Finch, a tall, imposing figure with an air of intellectual superiority, quickly established himself in a rented room at the edge of town, converting it into a makeshift laboratory. He was skeptical, yes, but also undeniably intrigued. His initial observations focused on the environment around the Caldwell home. He noted subtle shifts in air pressure, minute fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, and localized temperature drops that defied meteorological explanation. These anomalies were slight, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but they were consistently present. He found nothing conclusive, nothing he could categorize, but enough to confirm that something indeed was happening. Elias, who had grown accustomed to the isolation and the fear of the townsfolk, reacted to Professor Finch's scrutinizing presence with an almost imperceptible agitation. Though he remained largely silent and outwardly composed, the phenomena around him began to intensify, as if the boy's subconscious was responding to the invasive scientific gaze. Finch's meticulously set up equipment, designed to capture the slightest deviation, started to malfunction with alarming regularity. Delicate electrometers would suddenly give wildly erratic readings, their needles oscillating violently before snapping off entirely. Barometers would plummet and then spike, indicating impossible atmospheric changes. His photographic plates, carefully prepared to capture any unusual light phenomena, would often come out completely fogged or marred by strange, unidentifiable patterns. It was as if an unseen hand was deliberately sabotaging his efforts, mocking his scientific precision. Finch, a man unaccustomed to failure, grew increasingly frustrated. He began to experience strange drafts within his temporary lodging, sudden gusts of cold air that would sweep through the room even with windows and doors tightly sealed. Unexplained sounds, faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls, or the distinct rhythmic creaking of unseen footsteps in the empty hallway, plagued his nights, eroding his scientific detachment. A pervasive sense of being watched, of being followed by an unseen force, settled upon him, a feeling he, a man of pure reason, struggled to reconcile with his rational mind. He would turn abruptly, expecting to see something, only to find the room empty, the silence pressing in. Undeterred by the equipment failures and the unsettling atmosphere, Finch pressed on, convinced that with enough data, he could break through the wall of the unknown. He attempted to communicate directly with Elias, believing that understanding the boy's internal state might unlock the secrets of the phenomena. He tried various methods, simple questions, picture cards, even rudimentary psychological assessments of the era. Elias, however, remained an enigma. He would simply stare at Finch with those unnervingly deep blue eyes, offering no response, no flicker of understanding, no outward emotion. His silence was absolute, unyielding. The tests, designed to yield scientific data, produced nothing but more unsettling events. During one attempt to measure Elias's neurological responses, the glass vials on Finch's table suddenly vibrated, then shattered simultaneously, sending shards flying across the room, narrowly missing the professor. In another session, a precisely balanced pendulum, meant to detect minute shifts in gravity, began to swing wildly in impossible arcs, defying the laws of motion before crashing to the floor. The professor, initially a bastion of scientific objectivity, found his resolve slowly eroding. The constant failures, the inexplicable occurrences, and the pervasive sense of dread began to chip away at his rational facade. He had come to Blackwood Creek to explain the unexplainable, but instead, he was confronting a reality that defied all his established frameworks. The calm, detached scientist began to feel genuine fear. Elias was not just an anomaly, he was a living, breathing paradox, a force that actively resisted scientific inquiry. The lack of explanation, the sheer impossibility of it all, was terrifying. He witnessed firsthand the despair of the Caldwells, the haunted look in their eyes, the heavy burden of their isolation. He saw how Thomas, once a picture of sturdy resolve, now moved with a defeated slump, his attempts to protect his son constantly thwarted by the very nature of the child. He saw Sarah, a woman consumed by worry, her health visibly deteriorating, a constant tremor in her hands. Finch, who had always believed that knowledge brought power and control, was now faced with something that stripped him of both. Elias Caldwell was not merely a subject of study. He was an existential threat to Finch's entire worldview, a living, breathing testament to the limits of human understanding. The professor, a man who had dedicated his life to illuminating the dark corners of ignorance, found himself standing before an abyss, an unlit chasm that threatened to swallow not just his reputation, but his very sanity. The tension in the Caldwell home, already stretched taut, snapped with a sudden violent crack one blustery autumn afternoon. Professor Finch had been conducting another series of tests, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt to coax a measurable response from Elias. He had placed a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift from his own daughter, on a table between himself and the boy, hoping to provoke some subtle reaction. Elias sat utterly still, his gaze fixed not on the bird, but seemingly through it, into some unseen distance. Finch, exasperated, had leaned forward, his voice a low, urgent murmur, trying to break through the boy's impenetrable silence. It was then that the air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The small wooden bird, without warning, began to vibrate, a low hum emanating from its delicate form. Then, with a sound like splintering bone, it exploded, not outward, but inward, collapsing into a heap of fine, dry sawdust on the polished mahogany table. But this was merely the prelude, the true incident, the one that would forever etch Elias Caldwell into the collective memory of Blackwood Creek, occurred later that evening. A fierce storm had rolled in from the Atlantic, lashing the town with torrential rain and gale-force winds. The Caldwells, along with Professor Finch, who had found himself unable to leave, were huddled by the fireplace, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on their anxious faces. A sudden, deafening crack of thunder shook the house, followed by an unnerving silence. Then, a low, resonant groan began to emanate from the very foundations of the old home. The floorboards beneath their feet began to tremble, then buckle. A deep, jagged fissure tore through the plaster wall above the fireplace, snaking its way across the ceiling like a venomous serpent. Outside, the storm intensified, but the sounds now were not merely of wind and rain. A deep, grinding roar filled the air, a sound of immense structural stress. Thomas rushed to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass, his face paling to an ashen white. The old Blackwood Creek lighthouse, a stoic sentinel that had guided ships for over a century, its beacon a familiar comfort in the darkest nights, was swaying. Not just swaying from the wind, but visibly contorting, its sturdy stone base groaning under an unseen, immense pressure. Then, with a cataclysmic shriek of rending stone and twisting metal, the top half of the lighthouse, including its massive lantern room, tore free from its base. It didn't fall to the ground. Instead, it hesitated for a terrifying moment, suspended in the air, rotating slowly, as if held by an invisible, colossal hand. Elias, standing silently beside his mother, had turned his head towards the window, his eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the impossible spectacle outside. The detached section of the lighthouse then began to drift, slowly at first, then gaining speed, moving horizontally over the turbulent waves, disappearing into the storm-racked darkness of the open sea. The remaining stump of the lighthouse stood as a stark, broken monument to an impossible act. Professor Finch, witnessing this unparalleled display of raw, inexplicable power, felt his scientific worldview shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. His face, usually a mask of intellectual composure, was now contorted in a mixture of terror and profound awe. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, his carefully constructed theories collapsing around him. He had sought to explain, to categorize, to measure, but what he had just witnessed defied every known law of physics, every principle of engineering, every tenet of his scientific faith. There was no rational explanation. No known force could have accomplished such a feat. He found his voice, a strained, hoarse whisper. I have no explanation, none. This child, he defies all known laws. Physics, biology, natural philosophy. He simply exists outside of them. His admission was not merely a statement of fact. It was a surrender, a profound concession of defeat that shook him to his very core. His life's work, his unwavering belief in the order of the universe, had been irrevocably undermined by the silent, watchful boy in the corner of the room. He had come to debunk a superstition, and instead, he had encountered a living, breathing miracle, or perhaps a living, breathing horror, that rendered all his knowledge meaningless. The destruction of the lighthouse, a symbol of stability and safety, sent a wave of raw, unbridled terror through Blackwood Creek. The whispers that had once been confined to hushed tones now erupted into a cacophony of fear and outrage. The townspeople, already on edge, saw the impossible act as a direct threat, a malevolent force unleashed upon their community. They gathered in the town square, a furious mob illuminated by flickering torches, their faces contorted by fear and anger. "Something must be done," they cried, their voices a rising tide of hysteria. "The boy is a demon. He must be cast out." They demanded action, a definitive end to the terror that had plagued their lives for so long. Mr. Caldwell, standing before the enraged crowd, felt a crushing weight descend upon him. His heart was torn between paternal love and a desperate, horrifying realization. He had seen the lighthouse. He had seen the terror in Elias's eyes, not of malice, but of something far more unsettling, a profound, uncontrolled power that threatened to consume everything. He loved his son, but he also feared him. And for the first time, he truly believed Elias was a danger, not just to the town, but to himself. He knew he could not protect Elias from the mob, and perhaps more tragically, he realized he could no longer protect the town from Elias. A desperate, agonizing choice formed in his mind, born of fear, despair, and a misguided sense of duty. He had to remove Elias, for everyone's safety, for Elias's own safety, if such a thing was even possible. With a heavy heart and a voice thick with unshed tears, Thomas addressed the mob, promising to take Elias away. He would confine him, find a place where his strange abilities could not harm others. He didn't know where or how, but he would do it. He would remove the threat. A small contingent of townsfolk, men hardened by years of labor and driven by a desperate need for security, volunteered to help him. They were not malicious, not truly. They were terrified, and they believed they were acting to protect their homes, their families, their very way of life. The next morning, under a sky still bruised from the storm, Mr. Caldwell, accompanied by 3 grim-faced men, returned to his home. Their mission was clear: to take Elias, by force if necessary, and remove him from Blackwood Creek forever. This act, born of fear and desperation, was not an act of malice, but a tragic attempt to restore order to a world irrevocably fractured by the existence of a boy science couldn't explain. Thomas Caldwell, his face a mask of grim resolve, entered the quiet house. The air hung heavy, thick with the aftermath of the storm and the unspoken tension of their grim errand. Behind him, the three townsmen shuffled nervously, their eyes darting around the familiar, yet now alien space of the Caldwell home. Elias stood in the living room, a small, almost ethereal figure bathed in the pale morning light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. He looked at his father, his deep blue eyes betraying no emotion, no fear, no understanding of the impending betrayal. Sarah Caldwell sat nearby, huddled in a chair, her face etched with despair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, unable to meet her husband's gaze. Professor Finch stood a little apart, a silent, horrified observer, the weight of his scientific failure pressing down on him. Thomas took a deep breath, the foul taste of impending regret already bitter on his tongue. "Elias," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "we need you to come with us." He moved slowly, deliberately towards his son, his hand outstretched, not in comfort, but in a forced gesture of control. One of the townsmen, a burly fisherman named Silas, stepped forward, a length of rope coiled in his hand. The sight of it, though intended to merely secure, not harm, Elias, sent a fresh wave of nausea through Thomas. He had not intended for this, not truly, but the town's fear had become his own, and the image of the shattered lighthouse, an impossible feat of destruction, loomed large in his mind. As Silas took another step, the air around Elias began to shimmer, almost imperceptibly at first, like heat rising from a summer road. A low, resonant hum, barely audible, started to emanate from the boy. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate not just the air but the very marrow of their bones. Elias's eyes, usually so still and placid, now seemed to glow with an inner unearthly light. His small frame, previously so fragile, appeared to grow rigid, imbued with an unseen energy. This was not the quiet, unconscious manifestation of his earlier years. This was something different, something nascent and powerful, a response to the direct threat now facing him. Silas, emboldened by the silent boy, reached out, intending to grasp Elias's arm. But before his hand could make contact, the hum intensified, rising in pitch to a piercing whine. The very floorboards beneath Silas's feet buckled and splintered with a sharp crack, sending him stumbling backward. The rope flew from his hand, twisting and coiling in the air like a living snake, before lashing out and striking one of the other townsmen across the face with surprising force, leaving a crimson welt. This was no longer a passive phenomenon. This was an active, if still uncontrolled, surge of Elias's abilities. The room erupted into chaos. The glass panes in the windows, already weakened by the storm, exploded inward, showering shards across the floor. The wind, which had been merely a gust outside, now roared through the house, a localized tempest tearing through the living space. Furniture, heavy oak chairs and tables began to slide and scrape across the floor, then lifted into the air, spinning violently before crashing against the walls with destructive force. A large grandfather clock, a family heirloom, detached itself from its moorings, hovering for a moment, its pendulum wildly swinging, before smashing through the wall separating the living room from the kitchen. A sudden intense wave of cold swept through the house, so profound it felt like a physical blow. Their breath plumed in frozen clouds, and frost crystals instantly formed on the surfaces of the remaining furniture. Then, just as abruptly, the temperature swung to the opposite extreme. A searing, dry heat blasted through the room, making their skin crackle and their eyes sting. The wooden walls began to smoke, charring rapidly, the smell of burning timber filling their nostrils. Unnatural sounds, terrifying and disorienting, assailed their ears. The low growl of a predatory beast, the distant shriek of a woman, the distorted, guttural cries of something inhuman, all seemed to a man echo from every corner of the room. Yet from nowhere at all, it was a symphony of terror, designed to break the will, to shatter the mind. The very air vibrated with a malevolent energy, making it difficult to breathe, to think. It was as if the environment itself had become a hostile, sentient entity, directly opposing those who dared to threaten Elias. The townsmen, who had entered with grim determination, were now gripped by abject terror. They stumbled, fell, and cried out as objects flew past them, narrowly missing their heads. One man, struck by a spinning chair, collapsed, his arm bending at an unnatural angle. Silas, attempting to flee, was suddenly slammed against a wall by an invisible force, his head striking the plaster with a sickening thud. He slumped to the floor, unconscious, a trickle of blood staining his hair. The other remaining townsman, paralyzed by fear and confusion, simply stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror, muttering prayers. Thomas Caldwell watched in horror as his home, his sanctuary, was torn apart. He saw the destructive power unleashed, not by a conscious act of malice, but by the sheer, overwhelming force of his son's agitated presence. His initial fear for the town now morphed into a profound, gut-wrenching terror for Elias himself, and for what he was capable of. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Elias was not just unusual, he was a force of nature, an entity beyond human comprehension or control. The regret was a bitter bile in his throat. His decision, born of a desperate attempt to protect, had only served to unleash a greater catastrophe. He had tried to cage the wind, and in doing so had conjured a hurricane. Sarah Caldwell, who had been a silent, weeping witness to the escalating chaos, let out a choked sob. She reached out a trembling hand towards Elias, her instinct to protect her child overriding all fear. But before she could reach him, the vortex of energy around Elias intensified, spinning faster, tighter. The air around him became a blur, a haze of distortion. For a fleeting moment, as the chaos reached its terrifying crescendo, Elias's form seemed to waver, to become translucent, like a ripple in a pool of water. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The objects that had been flying through the air crashed to the floor. The unnatural sounds died away. The extreme temperatures dissipated, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ozone and charred wood. The wind rushing through the broken windows became merely the normal howl of the departing storm. Elias was gone. He hadn't run out the door, hadn't jumped through a window. He simply wasn't there. One moment he was standing amidst the maelstrom. The next, the space he occupied was empty, as if he had dissolved into the very air. It was as if he had never been truly bound by the physical space of the room, as if the concept of being somewhere was merely a suggestion for him, easily discarded. The void where he had stood was chilling, more terrifying than any destruction he had wrought. It was the ultimate defiance of their understanding, the final, inexplicable act. Thomas Caldwell stood amidst the wreckage of his home, his face streaked with tears and soot, gazing at the empty spot where his son had been. The cries of the injured townsman, the groans of Silas, the silent despair of Sarah, all faded into the background. All that remained was the chilling realization of what he had done, and the terrifying empty space where Elias had been. The boy science couldn't explain had simply vanished, leaving behind a trail of destruction, injured bodies, and a gaping, unfillable void in the fabric of their reality. Professor Finch, pale and trembling, could only stare at the empty space, his scientific mind utterly, irrevocably broken. He had witnessed the impossible, and it had left him with no answers, only an overwhelming, terrifying question mark. The town of Blackwood Creek, already scarred by the storm, was left in ruins, both physically and psychologically. The Caldwell home, once a beacon of quiet domesticity, stood as a testament to the night's terror, its broken windows like vacant eyes, its charred walls a grim monument to an incomprehensible event. The lighthouse, a symbol of their enduring connection to the sea, was a jagged stump, a constant chilling reminder of the raw, untamed power that had briefly resided among them. The air itself seemed to carry a lingering charge, a faint, metallic tang that spoke of forces unleashed and barely contained. Professor Alistair Finch, a man once defined by his unwavering adherence to logic and empirical evidence, found himself utterly undone. He diligently documented everything he had witnessed, his meticulous notes filling volume after volume. He described the impossible levitation of the lighthouse, the chaotic environmental shifts within the Caldwell home, the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of Elias. He detailed the injuries sustained by the townsman, Silas with a concussion and a broken arm, another with severe lacerations from flying debris, the third suffering from what doctors later termed hysterical paralysis, unable to move or speak for weeks. Finch's reports, filled with chilling observations and devoid of any scientific explanation, were met with disbelief and scorn by his esteemed peers in Boston. He was ridiculed, his reputation, once stellar, now tarnished beyond repair. They accused him of succumbing to local superstition, of fabricating sensational tales, or worse, of suffering a mental breakdown. Yet Finch knew the truth, a truth so profound and terrifying that it had reshaped his entire understanding of existence. He carried the weight of that truth, a solitary burden in a world that refused to acknowledge it. The Caldwells themselves were shattered. Sarah Caldwell, her spirit broken, never fully recovered from the trauma. She would often sit by the window staring out at the ravaged landscape, a silent, hollow shell of her former self, lost in a grief that was too complex for tears. Her hair, once a vibrant auburn, had turned stark white in a single night. Thomas Caldwell, consumed by guilt and despair, found himself an outcast in his own town. The townsfolk, though terrified of Elias, blamed Thomas for bringing such a curse upon them, for his perceived weakness in handling his demon child. The weight of his decision, his desperate act to remove Elias, now hung around his neck like a millstone, crushing him beneath its immense burden. He sold what little remained of his property for a pittance and, taking his broken wife, left Blackwood Creek under the cloak of night, never to return. Their destination remained unknown, their lives a perpetual flight from the ghost of a son they could neither understand nor forget. They were haunted not by the memory of a malevolent child, but by the terrifying reality of an alien presence that had briefly touched their lives, leaving only destruction and an unanswerable question in its wake. Professor Finch, however, could not simply walk away. The encounter with Elias had ignited an unquenchable obsession within him. He dedicated the rest of his life to understanding what he had witnessed. He traveled to remote corners of the globe, seeking ancient texts, forgotten lore, and esoteric theories that might offer a glimmer of explanation. He delved into quantum mechanics, theories of parallel dimensions, and the nascent fields of parapsychology, always hoping to find a framework, a scientific language, to describe Elias. His research became a solitary, relentless quest, consuming his every waking hour. He corresponded with reclusive scholars, studied obscure phenomena, and even risked his own sanity exploring the edges of human knowledge. Yet, he never found answers. The scientific community continued to dismiss him as an eccentric, a man whose brilliant mind had been irrevocably warped by an isolated incident. His reputation was indeed ruined, his once promising career relegated to the footnotes of scientific history. But he knew the truth, and that truth, however isolating, was his only companion. The truth about Elias, as Finch painstakingly pieced together from fragmented theories and his own harrowing observations, was not one of simple human anomaly. It was far more profound and unsettling. Finch began to theorize that Elias Caldwell was not merely a boy with extraordinary abilities, but something far more fundamental, far more ancient. He posited that Elias was, in essence, a gateway, not a conscious portal, but a living, breathing nexus where the fabric of their reality thinned and bled into another. He was a manifestation of something ancient, something utterly alien, a being from another dimension entirely. He wasn't evil, not in the human sense of malicious intent or malevolent will. He simply was. His existence defied the very laws of their universe because he operated under a different set of rules, a different physics, a different reality. The phenomena around him weren't intentional acts of power. They were merely the incidental effects of his presence, the ripples created by a being whose very essence was antithetical to the established order of their world. His emotions, however fleeting or subtle, acted as a catalyst, momentarily widening the fissure between dimensions, allowing raw, unfiltered energy to bleed through and manifest in ways that were both destructive and incomprehensible to human perception. Even years later, Blackwood Creek remained irrevocably changed. The physical scars of the storm faded, buildings were repaired, and the lighthouse was eventually rebuilt, albeit with a hauntingly modern design that never quite recaptured the stoic charm of its predecessor. But the psychological scars ran deep. The town became eerily quiet, a place where people spoke in hushed tones, where children were cautioned not to stray too far from home after dusk. Strange occurrences still happened, occasionally, a chilling reminder of the boy science couldn't explain. Unexplained cold spots would appear in homes, lingering for hours before vanishing without a trace. Objects would sometimes shift on shelves, or faint, unidentifiable whispers would echo in empty rooms. Plants in certain gardens would wither and die overnight, while others would bloom with unnatural vibrancy in the dead of winter. It was as if Elias had left an indelible imprint, a residual energy that occasionally flared, like the fading embers of a forgotten fire. The townspeople never spoke of it openly, but the collective memory of that terrifying night and the boy who had vanished into thin air permeated every aspect of their lives, a constant unsettling undercurrent to their otherwise mundane existence. Blackwood Creek had become a place touched by the unknown, forever marked by the brief, terrifying presence of an entity that defied all understanding. Blackwood Creek, once a quiet, unassuming coastal town, became known for its dark history, its name whispered in hushed tones across New England. The story of Elias Caldwell, the boy who vanished, was passed down through generations, growing into a local legend, a ghost story told around flickering hearths on long winter nights. It was a tale of inexplicable power, of a child not quite human, and of a terror that transcended the physical. The details blurred with each retelling, embellished and exaggerated, but the core truth remained. Something extraordinary and terrifying had happened here, something that defied comprehension. The old Caldwell house, never fully repaired, stood as a derelict monument to that night, its vacant windows staring out at the sea, a place where no one dared to venture after dark. Children were warned to steer clear, lest the Caldwell curse find them, or worse, lest the boy himself return. Even in the nascent years of the 20th century, as the world embraced new technologies and scientific advancements, Blackwood Creek clung to its unsettling past. The legend of Elias Caldwell refused to fade, woven into the very fabric of the town's identity. Fishermen would report strange lights on the water, moving with unnatural speed and silence, often accompanied by an inexplicable drop in temperature. Hikers in the dense woods surrounding the town sometimes spoke of encountering patches of air that felt impossibly heavy, or hearing faint, distorted whispers carried on the wind, just at the edge of audibility. These were always dismissed by outsiders as the ramblings of superstitious folk, but for those who lived in Blackwood Creek, they were chilling echoes, reminders of the profound strangeness that had once taken root in their quiet community. Decades passed, and the world hurtled towards modernity. The Great Wars came and went. Electricity brought light to every home, and automobiles replaced horse-drawn carriages. Yet the lore of Elias Caldwell persisted, evolving with the times. In the 1960s, a group of curious teenagers, armed with flashlights and a Ouija board, dared to spend a night in the ruins of the Caldwell house. They emerged shaken and pale, recounting tales of disembodied voices, objects moving on their own, and a suffocating sense of dread that had permeated the very walls. Their stories, though met with skepticism by most, only solidified the legend for the local populace. The house, they claimed, was a gateway, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place still haunted by the boy who was never truly human. In the late 1990s, with the advent of advanced scientific instruments, A team of paranormal investigators, drawn by the persistent rumors, journeyed to Blackwood Creek. They set up sophisticated equipment in and around the Caldwell property, hoping to capture evidence of the lingering phenomena. Their thermal cameras registered inexplicable cold spots that moved independently of air currents. Their electromagnetic field detectors spiked wildly in certain areas, indicating energy fluctuations far beyond natural levels. Sound recorders picked up faint, rhythmic hums and distorted vocalizations that defied identification. One night, a Geiger counter, brought along almost as a joke, began to click furiously in the exact spot where Elias had vanished. The readings, though intermittent, suggested a localized, inexplicable burst of radiation, fading as quickly as it appeared. The team, initially skeptical, left Blackwood Creek with more questions than answers, unable to logically explain the data they had collected. They published their findings in obscure journals, their research largely ignored by the mainstream scientific community, much like Professor Finch's meticulous notes from a century earlier. The enduring mystery of Elias Caldwell served as a constant, unsettling thought for those who dared to ponder it. No one ever truly understood him. Was he a child from another dimension, a nascent god, an accidental conduit for raw cosmic energy? Was he a being of pure thought, manifesting briefly in a physical form before returning to an ethereal state? His existence challenged everything known about the world, about biology, physics, and even the very nature of consciousness. He left behind not just physical destruction, but an open wound in the collective psyche of Blackwood Creek, a wound of fear and wonder that refused to heal. The boy with the unsettling eyes, the silent observer, the unwilling catalyst of chaos, had carved an indelible mark on their reality. The world, as humanity perceived it, was a finite, understandable place, governed by predictable laws. But Elias Caldwell had been a living, breathing contradiction to that comforting illusion. He was a stark, terrifying reminder that the universe was far vaster, far stranger, and infinitely more mysterious than human minds could ever grasp. His story became a cautionary tale, not of a monster, but of the unknown, of the terrifying possibility that there were forces, entities, and realities that existed just beyond the thin veneer of human perception, waiting to ripple through, to touch their world, and to leave an indelible, inexplicable mark. The chilling thought lingered, a cold whisper on the Maine breeze. What if Elias was not an isolated incident? What if he was merely a glimpse, a momentary tear in the fabric of reality, revealing that other things, equally incomprehensible, equally powerful, existed just beyond the threshold of human understanding? The world was bigger and stranger than we thought, and somewhere out there, perhaps even here, in the quiet corners of our seemingly ordered existence, other Eliases might be waiting, other boys and girls, or perhaps not boys and girls at all, whose very presence could unravel the known universe. And unlike Elias, they might not simply vanish, they might remain. The legend of Elias Caldwell was a terrifying testament to humanity's fragile grasp on reality, a powerful echo of the boy science couldn't explain. A boy who forever redefined the boundaries of the possible, leaving behind only questions, and the chilling certainty that the universe held secrets far more profound and far more unsettling than anyone could ever imagine. And sometimes, those secrets walked among us, silent and observant until provoked, until they simply were.